Okay, and welcome back, students who are taking financial accounting, and we are working on the Chapter 1 exercises, Group B, and we are on question exercise number 29. Now, the thing about this is, let me get a pen here. In the last problem, so if you go back and you look at the videos for 1-28B, in that particular video we were talking about the balance sheet, okay, and we created the balance sheet there, and I discussed some of the formatting issues for the balance sheet, and I had alluded to that we have issues for the income statement also. Well, in this problem here we're going to be dealing with the income statement and the statement of retained earnings for formatting issues. So let's jump into this problem. It says selected accounts of Alden have the following balances at December 31st, 2014. At the end of the first year of operations during the year, Lorraine Alden, the only stockholder, bought 5,400 of stock in the business. Okay. Now, I'm keeping that in the back of my mind, but remember, this is a word problem, and word problems, we have information that's directly related to solving a problem. We have information that's not related to solving the problem, has nothing to do with it. And then we have information that has to be manipulated. Okay, so in these kinds of problems, there's tons of data that has to be manipulated, adjusted, or whatever have you. And there's some that has to do with being directly related. But here's the catch. You have to be able to identify what is not useful, and you also have to be able to identify what needs to be manipulated. If it's manipulated, you might think it's not useful. So just bear that in mind when you're doing word problems. Okay, and the reason why I bring that up is because that's going to pertain to this $5,400 of stock. Now, just reading this first paragraph, if I didn't read anything else in the rest of the problem, my question is why am I being presented this information? Okay, and we'll find out as we work through this here. Okay, so we're given data. All right, we're given general ledger accounts and the balances in those accounts. I can actually create a trial balance as of December 31st, 2014 with this information, right? But it's presented in a different fashion. In the book, you'll see other formats for the trial balance. Things can be done in different ways as long as all the concepts are correct. All right. So the requirements: identify each as an asset, liability, revenue, or an expense. Then number 2, prepare the income statement for the year ended December 31st, and what is the result of the operations. In other words, it's asking us what's the profit or loss. And then 3, assuming the balance in the retained earnings on December 31st was 21.6, what was the amount of the dividends during the year? Okay, so that's what the question is asking me. What is the amount of the dividends? Answer by preparing a statement of retained earnings to solve for the dividends. Recall that the business has just completed its first year and has no beginning balance for retained earnings. Okay, so we know that that's an important piece of information. Okay, again, directly related, nothing to do with the problem, and manipulated. All right. So let's start with number 1 here, and it says identify each as an asset, liability, revenue, or expense. So office furniture is something that we own, so that's an asset. If you see the word expense, that's an expense. Accounts payable is something we owe, so that's a liability. Notes payable, something we owe. So when you see the words payable, immediately you start thinking liability. Service revenue, it has revenue in the account title, so it's revenue. Accounts receivable is something we own, meaning somebody owes us money, so that's an asset. Supplies expense is an expense. So rent expense is obviously an expense. Cash is something we own. We know that's an asset. Office supplies. Okay, office supplies is something we own. All right. So that's an asset. Now, if it had said office supplies expense, then that would be an expense, okay? But it doesn't say expense, it just says office supplies. So you have to be careful because think about, especially when it comes to office supplies, because think about, say Staples or an Office Max, okay? They sell office supplies, right? And they also use office supplies in the operation of their business. Okay, so if they're selling it, that means they're inventorying the office supplies, and that's what makes it an asset because they own those office supplies that they're going to resell. But if they, let's say they buy a case of pens or just legal pads or just say copy paper, okay? They buy a pallet of copy paper and they break out one of the boxes. Well, that whole pallet of, copy paper, all right, that is an asset. They're reselling that, okay? But if they take one of those boxes and they decide to open it up and use it, that's an expense, right? Because they're using it in the operation of the business, okay? So just be careful of office supplies. All right, let's see here. Okay, so then we have salary expense as an expense. Salaries payable as a liability. Notice the difference here. One says expense, the other one says payable. That's, how you determine which one is which. Property tax expense and equipment is something we own, so that's an asset. All right, so the reason why we identified all of these is because we need to know which ones are our revenue and our expenses in order to be able to create an income statement. Okay, so let's go to another slide here, and I'm going to now create the income statement because that's what number 2 says. Prepare the income statement to find out what the result of our operation is. In other words, our profit or loss. Now, just like in the exercise 1-29B and doing the balance sheet, I'm going to, because I'm working with a digital pen, I'm not going to make this completely professional. I mean, I would be if I'm using a word processor, then I'm going to spell things out. I'm going to make sure I have capitalization correct. I'm going to have spelling correct. I'm going to make sure that my indentation is perfect. And I'm not going to abbreviate. Okay, I'm going to have underlines, double underlines where I need. All right, but because I'm using a digital pen, I'm not going to be the neatest, and in saving time, I'm not going to be writing everything out just in the interest of time. So, I'll point things out, but just be aware that, your financial statement should look like what the solution looks like. And also, too, remember that the lines on the paper doesn't matter. When I'm going to create an income statement, I'm basically going to have 2 columns. I'm going to have a debit column. No, I'm sorry, not a debit column. I'm going to have 2 columns because I have mathematical calculations. Well, if I only had a 2-column paper, okay, that's a 2-column ledger sheet. That's what I should be using for the income statement. But what if I only have 4-column paper? Okay. Well, you can still use 4-column paper, okay? You would use this column and you would use this column and you'd leave this column and this column blank. You'd put in your descriptions here and you'd put in your amounts over here and you leave these 2 columns blank. So it doesn't matter the lines on the paper. I could use blank copy paper, okay? And that's basically what this slide, this PowerPoint slide looks like, is a blank copy paper. So as long as I'm putting the information in the correct way, the formatting of it, it doesn't matter about the lines on the paper. Okay, so let's get into creating this here income statement. Okay, so for an income statement, just like any financial statement, we're going to have a header. And so this is Alden Consulting Inc. And I abbreviated this. You should handwrite it out. um, the type of financial statement it is. So this is an income statement, and I'm abbreviating statement here. Okay, and the date. Now, on the balance sheet, remember the balance sheet is shows the financial position of the company. So it's as of a specified date. Okay, but for both the income statement and the statement of retained earnings, both of these are for a period of time. Okay, why? Because it's showing the operation of the business. And when we look at the operation of the business, we look at it in periods of time, meaning if, let's say, our accounting period is monthly. Okay, so at the beginning of the month, meaning the first of the month, right, all of our account balances need to be zero. I mean, how else am I supposed to measure from one, each period to the next? Sure, I could take ending balances and be rolling them over and doing all of the math, but as you recall, our accounting equation on the balance sheet is out of balance at the end of an accounting period. So we have to bring it back into balance by closing out all of our accounts to our equity section. And when we do that, our balances are zero. So at the beginning of the accounting period, with the balances being zero, we have transactions throughout the month, and then on the last day of the accounting period, we have ending balances, right? And they get closed out so that we start over again in the next period at zero. Okay, so and that way, we can measure from, even though you're thinking month to month, you also have to think in terms of year to year, meaning, if I was looking at January of last year, I'm looking at those figures, well then, I can use that as a comparison for what I did in January this year to see if I'm doing better or worse. So our income statement and our statement of retained earnings is for a period of time. And in our heading, we state whatever that period is by saying for the, I can either say period ending, come on, pen, period ending, and whatever the date is. So in this case, it's December, and I'm abbreviating here, 31st, 2014. I can state it as for the period ending, or I can state it as the accounting period that we're using, meaning for, in this case, for the month ending December, and I'm abbreviating here, 31st, 2031, 2014. Okay. So if this happened to be quarterly, well then it would be for the quarter ending. If this was yearly, it would be for the year ending. All right. But the point being is that the date has to reflect the period of time. Okay. And of course, the heading has to be center aligned. Should be center aligned. All right. Just like on the balance sheet. So the only difference between the income statement and the statement of retained earnings is that the name of the statement. Instead of income statement, it would say statement of retained earnings. All right. Okay, so now we're looking at the income statement here, and there's a few concepts that I have to cover here. I'm going to get into. Right. If we have only one account, one general ledger account, like we do for the revenue accounts, from our data here, you see here, we only have the one revenue account. Okay. Remember, our income statement is revenues less our expenses to give us a profit or loss. Okay, so the reality is that I can have as a heading, as accounts, I can have just one general ledger account called revenue, and then I can have one ledger account called expense, okay? And I would then put whatever amount the revenue is, and then I'd have whatever amount the expense account is, underline it because it's a calculation, and then I'd have whatever amount is for my either net income or net loss, or I could call it profit slash loss. Okay, and that's on its most simplistic level. But this, we can't obtain any, and of course this is double underlined because it's the end of the calculation. Of course we can't obtain any information from this. I mean, the only information we get out of this is whether we had a profit or loss. So we want to be able to analyze the information much better, and in doing that we're expanding these different sections by creating additional ledger accounts, right? Okay, by having the additional ledger accounts, like for example, payroll expense, rent expense, utility expense, advertising expense, this allows us to be able to analyze the information better. So the question now becomes is how do we put that information on our income statement? Well, to do that, and we'll use expense because it's going to be easier for me to explain it this way. I'm going to put expense and then I'm going to indent and begin to list my expenses. And you list the expenses in the order that you see them on your trial balance, because on your trial balance you're going to have your ledger accounts, right? And the amounts in the accounts, right? And of course they're going to have account numbers, right? Well, the way that they're listed on your trial balance is the way that you list them on your income statement. All right. So in this case here, I'm going to have a salary expense. I'm going to have a rent expense. And notice I indented here. Okay, so you should have that indentation. Right? And I am just abbreviating the word expense. So I have utilities. I have supplies. And I have property tax. And I have, okay, and that's all of my expenses. So if you come back up here to the data, okay, you see there's my utility expense, there's my supply expense, rent expense, my salary expense, and my property tax expense. Okay. So that's what I'm doing is I'm listing those here. Now, I'm going to cover a concept as far as calculations are concerned. Okay, remember, basic revenue less expense. So I'd have a number here and a total here. But whenever I have a mathematical calculation, what I want to do is I want to move over one column to the left, right? Go one column to the left and list all of that information to do the mathematical calculation, all right? So what I'm getting at here, and you'll see this in comparison to the revenue, all right? Because in the revenue account, I only have one revenue account. But for my expenses, I have a bunch of them. So I'm going to have, and I'm going to erase this line later, but I want you to think in terms of two columns, a column on the right and the column on the left, right? So whenever I'm going to have a mathematical calculation, which is what I'm going to do for these expenses, I want to know what the total expenses are, okay? That figure for the total expense is going to go over here in the right-hand column, but the mathematical calculation for it is going to be here in the left-hand column. So I have to put all of these figures, 43,000, 18,000, 12,600, 3,400, and 2,400 in the left-hand column. And of course, since this is the first number in the column, I put a dollar sign, right, to denote, that these are dollar amounts and not digital amounts, right? And when I do that math, okay, I have to put an underline because it shows a mathematical calculation, and then that means my total expense is 79,400. When I add all of those up, it goes right there, okay? Now, for revenues, I only have one account, okay? And it was called service revenue. Now, I can list the revenue here, and I can list service revenue here. But because there's only one amount, and that makes up the total amount of revenues, I could put that in my right-hand column, which was 161,000, because I have no mathematical calculation. And since it's the first number in the column, I put the dollar sign. Okay. Now, if you look at the solution, you'll see that the word revenue is not there, okay? And that's fine because I only have the one account and it's designated as service revenue. But get more in the practice of putting revenue, putting an expense. Because remember, on the balance sheet you had assets, you had liabilities, and you had equity, okay? So do the same thing on the income statement. Put the word revenue, and even though you only have one account, okay, list the one account beneath it and make sure that you're indenting, all right? And then put the amount, since you only have the one account, that's the total amount, over on the right. Now, if I had more than one account, obviously I would put the second account name, and just like doing expenses, all right, I'd have a mathematical calculation. So let me do it in blue. So I'd list my extra, whatever other accounts, and I'd have the dollar sign, and I have an amount, and I'd have an amount, and then I have an underline, and I'd put the total revenues here, right? And I would label this as total revenues. Why? Because I have my total revenues in this column less my expenses, which is going to give me my profit or loss. Okay, so look at what's happening here. Okay, I have my revenues less my expenses, and I have an underline, and then my profit or loss would have a double underline. Okay, so let me erase all of this out, clean it up, because then it will look more correct. Okay, all right, and it'll be a little bit easier to follow. So for my revenues, I have a dollar sign because it's the first number, 161,000. Okay. Now notice that there's no underline underneath the 161,000. That means that it's part of a mathematical calculation, okay, that'll be continued down the column. And since I have my revenues less my total expenses, right, so I have 161,000 less 79,400, I draw an underline because that shows the mathematical calculation, and then I will have my net, income in this case because it's a profit, or I could have written net profit, all right, and that amount is going to be $81,600, and I double underline that because that's the end of the calculation, and I put a dollar sign because it shows that dollar as being the dollar amount. Okay, so hopefully you followed all of that, and I'm at 24 minutes and I still have to do the statement of retained earnings, but I'm not going to repeat some of this information. Okay, the important thing to remember here, and you're going to create enough of these here financial statements that from doing it again and again and again, you'll get used to it. But remember, all numbers go in the right-hand column, okay, unless you're going to do a mathematical calculation, in which case you move one column to the left, list the numbers, and then put the total amount on the right, okay, which is what we did here, for the expenses, right? So you have a column here, and you have a mathematical calculation. The solution goes on the right. Then you do all of the math in this column, okay, and the double underline shows where the end of that calculation is, right? Having the underlines and double underlines is important. People who read financial statements, they rely upon that in order to be able to determine, what they're looking at. If they don't see a double underline, then the thing that's they're questioning is where's the rest of the mathematical calculations. If they don't see a single underline, they're wondering what other information could be added, or should be here that isn't. Okay, so it's very important with formatting. All right, and as an FYI, when you're taking tests, if you don't have the formatting correct, you will lose points. So put the category here, put the category here, indent, when you're listing your ledger accounts, and of course use some logical sequence as to showing, here's revenue, expense, net income. Notice they're all aligned to the left, but yet all of my expense accounts are indented, and so is my total expense. Okay, so just follow that when you're doing that work. Okay, now number 3 said, assuming the balance in retained earnings on December 31st was 2,100, right? So that's the ending balance, right? Because it's December 31st, 21,600. What was the amount of the dividends during the year? Okay. Answer by preparing a statement of retained earnings to solve for the dividend. All right, recall that it's the first year of business, so there is no beginning retained earnings. All right, so we create the statement, and I'm not going to go over the heading because I did it just previously. So this would say statement, and you'd write this all out of retained earnings. Of course, you'd write that all out and all of that out. And remember, the heading date has to be correct, so it's for the month. I'm sorry, for the year ended. Sorry, for the year. Ended or ending December 31st, 2014. Now, when it comes to our statement of retained earnings, we have a beginning, and we have to list the date. So that would be January 1, 2014. Okay, we have to put in the date to know when this, the beginning of this statement, where it starts, because remember, it's for a period of time. And then of course we have our retained earnings at the end. Okay, so we have an ending retained earnings, so that has to have a date. Okay, and I'm abbreviating here, 31/2014. Right. So we knew that from our data, our retained earnings at the beginning of the year was 0. Okay, and we have to put a $sign because it's the first number in that column. And we know that we want to know what our ending retained earnings is going to be, right? So we're going to have all of this mathematical calculation in between. So I could put in a single underline, and then I'm going to have an amount for that ending retained earnings, and I'm going to have a double underline under that amount, because this whole column is going to be a mathematical calculation. Now, when we take retained earnings, we know we have to add in, okay? So I put the word add, net income, which comes from our income statement, which in this case was $81,600. Excuse me. And I'm going to, show that as a subtotal. Okay. Now you might be asking, well, why, since this is a mathematical calculation, why don't I just move it over, move these two figures over to the column on the left and put the mathematical figure and the calculation on the right? You can do that, okay? You could have had in the left-hand column, 0, and then 81.6. Okay, draw an underline and then put the subtotal 81.6. Okay, and notice I have the dollar sign. Right, the way you just saw me before I erased it and the way I did it here, both are correct. Okay. However, with the statement of retained earnings, we have more of a tendency to show all of the information in one column just going right down the page, because we don't have a whole bunch of accounts that we're going to be adding up. It's only one line item, one description. Okay, so since we don't have many many line items to be adding up, we don't put them in, we don't have to put them in the left-hand column. Okay, if it was if we had 2 or 3 or 4 line items that were adding up as a mathematical calculation, well then yeah, we would put it in, we would go to the left and put the total in the right. Right, so now we add in our net income, and then we take out our dividends. So we write the word less and we write dividends. Now we don't know how much the dividends are, right? Because in our data, it told us to solve for the dividends, right? But it did tell us that our ending retained earnings was 21,600. So if we have our ending retained earnings of 21,600, okay, well, if you know 2 out of 3 things, you can always figure out the third. And we're trying to figure out what our dividends are, right? So if I have 81,600 as my subtotal plus whatever my dividends were is equal to 21,600, right? How do we figure out how much the dividends are? Well, 21,006. We move the 81,000 across the equal sign. So we have 21,600 minus 81,600, which is equals 60,000. Okay, so we know that the dividends that we paid out were 60,000. And I'm going to write that as a positive number here, okay? Right. And the reason why I write it as a positive number, because I have the word less here, okay? The word less tells me that I'm going to subtract out this amount, okay? If I wrote the word less and I put brackets, or I wrote a negative 60,000, well then that tells me that I would actually be adding it in. Why? Because a negative times a negative is a plus, all right? So I have to have the word, when I write the word less, which denotes that I'm going to subtract out whatever this positive number, in this case here, 60,000 is. And that makes sense because I have a subtotal of 81,000, and then I'm less 60,000, I'm subtracting it out, and it gives me $21,000. Okay, and that's what my financial statement for the statement of retained earnings looks like. Okay, so I hope you had gotten all of that. Look at the solution and see what it looks like in a much nicer, cleaner format. I mean, to be honest with you, if I'm doing this on my, if I'm working this out for a business, okay, regardless of whether it's the income statement or the statement of retained earnings, I'm not going to be very neat. I am going to format things in the right format, and I'm going to be taking shortcuts. Like I wouldn't write income statement. I'd probably just write, IS, okay, right here, because I knew that that's what that's going to be. But when I actually am going to present the information, I'm going to type it up in a Word document and make sure everything is written out. I don't abbreviate. I center a line. I format the columns correctly. I use the dollar signs. I use underlines, double underlines. I indent where I have to. Okay. I don't abbreviate. I make sure my capitalization and my spelling is correct. And I produce a professional financial statement, because a financial statement is a professional document. So those of you who are taking business management and are just trying to get through, realize that you need to do it that way. You know, the accountants, it's expected. You're the ones that are going to be creating the financial statements. Business managers are going to be using the financial statements, but they need, you know, if you're in business management, realize that that's what an accountant goes through, and they have to because it follows the generally accepted accounting principles. Okay. All right. So, you know, that's the end of this particular problem, and I will see you in the next video for the next problem. And again, if you have any questions, watch the video again. And you know, try to pick it up, and if you still don't understand something, feel free to call and speak with an instructor. Okay.